Yesterday and couldn't resist bringing them greetings from the Indian cricket team. I want to say hello to you. I've been waiting for this moment because last year I was in London and went to see the thrashing they took at Lord's, and thereafter I don't think they have ever recovered since. I don't know if they still have. We'll find out. There's a lot of water to go under the bridge. I started following cricket and then they made me more humble than I ever wanted to be. The Indian team did it. Then I moved to Toronto and followed the Toronto Maple Leafs in hockey. They made me even more humble than I was planning to be. Then I followed the Atlanta Braves, where we live in Atlanta, Georgia, and they dragged me down a notch further. So I've come to the conclusion if I don't watch, my teams win. If I do watch, they lose. In fact, they were doing very well till I started following the score. Then I don't know what happened, 101 for no loss or something like that on the second day. All that is though secondary. I'm very happy to be with you, especially happy to be here with Nikki. Your faith has spoken of all over the world, and then to be here with Tim leading the worship, where the songs he's written are sung all over the world as well. And I want to say a delight to be here at HTB Brompton, and also to those of you at Onslow Square and at Queensgate, a special welcome to you. You are fortunate to be watching it on a screen and not to be having this glimpse too close at hand. It's good to join you. You know, the story is told of an Indian Punjabi farmer who was talking to a Texan. Texans are known to think large. And so this Texan was talking to the Punjabi farmer and he said, "Mr. Singh, how big is your farm in Punjab?" And the man said, "If you look about 25 yards ahead, you see that lamppost? Yeah, my farm is about that long and that wide." He said, "You know, Mr. Singh, how big my ranch is in Texas? If you got into my car at sundown, at sunrise every day and kept driving and driving and driving and driving and driving, somewhere around mid-morning or midday, you will reach the end of my property line." And the Punjabi man said, "I know exactly what you mean. I used to have a car just like that." So across these fault lines of language and culture, it's very easy to miss the point. And I'm racing across. You know, English is the only language I know in which the watch runs. In Hindi, ghadi chal rahi hai, which means the watch is walking. And the French, in good militaristic term, I think it's marche, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know what it is, but maybe that's the equivalent of walking too. But most of my talks have to be done in English, and the watch runs, and it will run, because we've got a second service to follow. So if you will race in your thoughts with me, we'll do our best to get at least the heart of what I want to say to you across cultural lines and language lines and historic lines, because I'm going to take you back a good 25 to 2600 years ago. And my message to you this morning is entitled, "Lessons from History, the Tale of Two Men." We are just coming off the elections in the United States. So much is going on in geopolitical maneuvering. Today's newspapers, on the front page, you see the picture of a building in flames in Gaza. Troops are being mounted at the border. All kinds of demagogues are facing rebellions and opinions of the masses that they're unable to resist anymore. And sometimes they run from the arms of a lion into the arms of a bear. The media may give it the appendage called spring. Who knows what all these things really mean? We like to taint them and paint them in ways where we seem to reveal this vulnerability that we all have, that our hope is ultimately in political leadership. It's fascinating to me that when the Old Testament people move from the Exodus to the times of the judges and on to the kings, you begin to see what Martin Luther meant when he said, history is like a drunken man reeling from one wall to the other, knocking itself senseless with every hit. It used to be maybe in the mid-40s or 60s or something, the Dickensian phrase could have been brought to the fore, you know, the best of times and the worst of times. But it seems to be quite appropriate almost at any time. What is history really all about? Is it really an accumulation of multiple biographies? Or is it, like Henry Ford said, just a lot of bunk? What is history all about? It was some years ago that I recall being in Amman, Jordan. My wife, my colleagues, and I, we'd just gotten off the plane and we were heading to do some sightseeing when somebody from the palace called and asked if we would come by to pay a quick visit. We were really in our very casual clothes, and we told them that. And Prince Raj said, "That's all right. I'd like to have a few minutes with you before you begin the meetings." I never met the gentleman. He's the last heir to the throne in Iraq, in Jordan. And we sat down across, and not knowing what kind of conversation to make with a man of his stature, I just looked at him and I said, Your Highness, I said, what do you think is the greatest need in this part of the world? He's a very well-thinking man and very soft-spoken. He said, it is the same need in any part of the world. Two things, he said, leadership and youth. The world is desperately in need of leaders, he said, and the youth are desperately in need of watching good models of leadership. And if we fail in those two areas, he said, there is no great hope for the future of this world. Leadership and youth. Remember the story, the words penned by Percy Bysshe Shelley. But maybe before I read that to you, let me turn to the scriptures and then at least give you the theoretical backdrop, the historic backdrop on which I want to base my message. 2 Kings 21. Manasseh has just succeeded his father Hezekiah, who had reigned for about 29 years. And Manasseh is going to take the reins now for 55 years. See what it says about him. He was 12 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 55 years. That's 2 Kings 21. His mother's name was Hephzibah. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, following the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. He rebuilt the high places his father Hezekiah had destroyed. You notice that one line? He rebuilt the high places his father Hezekiah had destroyed. He also erected altars to Baal and made an Asherah pole, as Ahab king of Israel had done. He bowed down to all the starry hosts and worshipped them. He built altars in the temple of the Lord, of which the Lord had said, in Jerusalem, I will put my name. In both courts of the temple of the Lord, he built altars to all the starry hosts. He sacrificed his own son in the fire, practiced sorcery and divination, and consulted mediums and spiritists. He did much evil in the eyes of the Lord, provoking him to anger. Well, 55 years after his reign came to an end in an amazing way, in the last few months of his reign, he repented, tried to undo all that he had done. It was a bit too late to change the course of the nation. He was succeeded by his son Amon, who reigned for just 2 years. And then after Amon came Manasseh's grandson, Josiah. And in chapter 22 it says this: Josiah was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 31 years. His mother's name was Jedidah, daughter of Adaiah. She was from Bozkath. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord and walked in all the ways of his father David, not turning aside to the right or to the left. Remember the words of Shelley? I met a traveler from an antique land who said, two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that the sculptor well those passions read, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear: My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains round that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. Nothing beside remains round that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. If you go to those desert terrains today, you'll see many a broken statue of a one-time demagogue, and the sculptor well those passions read, and those expressions still remain on these broken and stone-made things. I think it was the words of Samuel Taylor Coleridge that often come to mind. He says this: if men could only learn from history what lessons it might teach us, But passion and party blind our eyes, and the light which experience gives us is a lantern on the stern which shines only on the waves behind us. And the light which experience gives us is a lantern on the stern which shines on the waves behind us. Or the famous aphorism of Santayana, he who refuses to learn from history is forced to repeat its mistakes. Take a look at these two historical panels here. Two men taking the nation in two different directions, and it started with some extraordinary decisions they themselves made. Manasseh from 697 to 642 before Christ, following on the heels of a father who had ushered in one of the greatest revivals the people had ever known. How does this happen? How does it happen that you could be raised at a time in history where you see the blessing and prosperity that results from piety, that results from getting yourself aligned with the will of God, that some young upstart comes and wants to change everything, think they've got something unique to give, some brand of leadership that previous generations did not know or do not know. And here he came, having inherited all of that. How is it somebody put it? First piety begat prosperity, and then the daughter divorced the mother? How piety begat prosperity, and then the daughter divorced the mother? You get blessed as you walk and stride with God, and then that strange shift comes in imagining that this came about because of some great extraordinary strength you yourself had, and you're going to do it alone. Nations are on that precipitous edge right now. I cannot believe that in North America, the average person has not yet seen, who is a skeptic, that all that has befallen, the lifestyle and the so-called fiscal cliff that we face and so on, has come about from abandoning the very principles that had guided for a long time the strength that the nation had. Those undergirding ideas have been tossed to the winds. And so terribly shaken now, financially, morally, spiritually, in families, till we do not know how to define the most fundamental questions of life. What does it mean to be human? What does marriage mean? What does sexuality mean? You ask an average university student, they're all at sea with these definitions. And we see, looking at leadership, going up without chart or compass, and yet making all kinds of arrogant promises to the populace. There were three decisions Manasseh made. Number one, he decided to react against his father's reformation and pull down the fences that his father had built. G.K. Chesterton said, whenever you take down any fence, always pause long enough to ask, why was it put there in the first place? Why were these fences put up? Now, I want to tell you something very important in just a few fleeting moments here. The distinction between the Hebrew race and those around them lay in this one fundamental idea. Follow me carefully. Any worldview you can study, I challenge you to think of it, any major religious worldview always makes one assumption, that if your goodness outweighs your badness, sooner or later that break will come for you, whether it's through karma or through righteousness or whatever it is. You will break free by volitionally pulling yourself up by your moral bootstraps. That's the assumption. Take any major worldview, that's the way it is, except for the Judeo-Christian faith. When God rescued his people from Egypt and took them into the promised land, righteousness and the moral law was given to them, but only as a sequence to redemption. They were redeemed first, then given the moral law, and then given the prescription for worship. You could never alter that sequence in the Hebrew mind. Redemption, righteousness, and worship. You cannot be righteous until you are first redeemed. You cannot worship until you're first redeemed and righteous. This was unique in its time. The heart was desperately in need of correction and redemption. That talks about your heart, my heart, every human heart. D.L. Moody said, if you take a man who's stealing nuts and bolts from a railway track and you send him to college or educate him, at the end of it, he will steal the whole railway track. It's the way it goes. We just get more sophisticated in our manipulations and our methods of deceit. That's exactly the way it is. India is a land of great mathematical and scientific geniuses, and yet the one thing that could totally destroy the country is its inability to cope with corruption. Virtually every man or woman who is involved in bringing about the Commonwealth Games to India, a great accomplishment, is now in prison. That's how it goes. And so when God was speaking to leaders, He taught them that the heart is in need of redemption. The leader's heart, your heart, my heart. And what happens with a man like Manasseh? He comes and takes all of these barricades away. And the next step follows logically. He accelerated the development of heathenism. Chesterton went on to make this comment. He said, the tragedy of disbelieving in God is not that a person ends up believing in nothing. Alas, it is much worse. A person may end up believing in anything. The tragedy of disbelieving in God is not that a person may end up believing in nothing. Alas, it is much worse. May end up believing in anything. Think of the things we have now actually begun to believe. Once upon a time, the shock value of those things were great. You know, I very seldom really have time to watch too much. And I'm so hesitant to even mention something like this. But while flying in on this time, I just turned on to see if I could get some of the news or whatever. And there was some comedian that was on. I was absolutely shocked just to hear his first quip. One of the crudest of all words you could think of, placed beside God. Do these people really care? Do these people really care? That's all it took for me, just 15 seconds, and I said, this is not even funny. But you know, when you lack the genius and the skill to make people laugh, you shock them with filth and vulgarity, and that takes the place of humor. That's what's happening. Whether it's political leadership, whether it's the entertaining world, all of a sudden you pull down these barricades and you find you're unable to stop the tsunami of worldviews and tsunami of ideas. And that's exactly what happens here. First, he leads a reaction against his father's Reformation. Next, it starts developing the acceleration of heathenism and all kinds of strange beliefs. And the third thing that follows is he instituted a bitter persecution of the prophets. Sequence. Take away the true God, bring in false worship, persecute those who want to remind you of the true God. It's a logical and a chronological sequence. What happened as a result? Number one, it tells you that it is possible for one person to lead millions into untold evil. It is possible for one man, one woman to lead millions into untold evil. It is in the 1980s, when I was relatively young and starting my own ministry, that I was invited to speak at the universities in Poland. And after speaking at Warsaw that first day and heading on to Krakow and so on, my host asked me if I'd like to go and visit Auschwitz. And I told him, I said, you know, Henrik, I've seen concentration camps. He said, no, which ones have you seen? I said, well, Dachau and Birkenau and all of that. He said, no, this is a death camp. Have you seen one? I said, what's the difference? He said, come and see it. So we drove and drove for about an hour and a half or two. It was a cold, foggy, gray day. And as we arrived in Auschwitz, I wasn't emotionally prepared for what I was going to see. You walk from room to room. Any one of you has been there, and I'm sure many of you have. And I saw some teenagers being ushered from room to room, and some of them ultimately had to leave sobbing. I don't know what connections they bore, but they saw the, quote, the hell that had broken loose in that setting. And as I was taken from room to room, I remember in one room behind glass was 12,000 pounds of women's hair, women who'd been shaven bald before they were taken into the gas ovens and the hair woven into sacks and sold on the streets. There were tiny little suitcases and toothbrushes, children's clothing and baggage there behind glass, and pictures of castrated twins at the hands of Joseph Mengele standing like this, looking almost like glassy-eyed and dazed. And then as you're about to enter what was the gas chamber where they were being obliterated at the rate of 12,000 every day, are the words of Adolf Hitler, I want to raise a generation of young people devoid of a conscience, imperious, relentless, and cruel. And then there are some historians today and some so-called watchdogs of what we tell and what we don't tell who actually want to remove the story of the Holocaust from the history books. As if we don't need to be reminded of what happens when one person can lead millions into untold evil. I remember speaking at the Center for Geopolitical Strategy in Moscow, talking to the general there, and the stories of Joseph Stalin. I don't have time to go into that. But I remember as my wife and I were talking to him and reminding him of what Stalin had done, this general who was the chief of the historical department at this Center for Geopolitical Strategy sat across the table and the tears were running down his face. The chief of staff looked at me as we walked out of there. He grabbed my hand, kissed the back of my wife's hand, and he said to me, Dr. Zacharias, he said, what you have told us about God and society is true, but it's very difficult to change after 70 years of believing a lie. That was his goodbye speech to us. One person can lead millions into untold evil. Secondly, and the reason one can lead millions into untold evil is because most people don't know how to think anymore. The art of critical thinking is gone. The laws of logic have gone. At the University of Iowa some years ago, I was giving a talk on coherence and culture. And at the end of it, a woman ran up to the microphone, 1,500 in the audience, packed to capacity. She could hardly wait, I guess, till the turn came for questions. She cupped her hand because she didn't think the microphone was good enough and just yelled at me from the back of the room, who in the world ever told you life needed to be coherent? She said, where did this come from? Is this not another Western idea? You're just foisting upon that. And she went on, and I've learned after some time, you allow people to talk long enough, they'll end up convicting themselves. And so she was going on and on and on, and finally I said, ma'am, I'll be happy to answer your question if you could just give me one clue to help, how I can help you the best. You're asking me who told me life needed to be coherent? Is that your question? She said, yeah. I said, will you allow me to ask you a question? Would you want my answer to be coherent, or can my answer be incoherent? She just stands and looked like I'd just planted a dagger in her ribs or something. And the audience burst out laughing. I said, no. I said, I want to hear her. Is it okay for my answer to be incoherent, or do you want my answer to be coherent? See, they live by ideas that they attack others with, but they daren't give that other person the privilege of questioning their assumptions. In other words, she was living a totally incoherent life. But when it was exposed in the flaws of her very reasoning, that I had to be coherent in my answer, then she was living by one set of rules, but foisting a completely different set of rules on the other person. And the last thing is, first, one person can lead millions into untold evil. Secondly, because most people can't think. Number three, it's because their end result is the ultimate test of any civilization is what we do with our own children. That's the ultimate test of any civilization. What do you think of when you see these little ones sitting in front of you and singing, celebrating life? What goes through your mind and your emotions? I've just become a grandfather for the first time, but I'll always remember Winston Churchill's caution. When a corporal once said to him, Mr. Churchill, I've never told you about my grandchildren, have I? Churchill said, no, and I want you to know how much I appreciate it. So I will not bore you with that. But I'll tell you what, you watch that tiny little tyke second time around. There's something within your heart that has more emotions reserved for response, because first time around, most of those emotions are distributed in care. You're exhausted caring for the little one. As a grandparent, you've got more of the reserves without the expenditure. That's somebody else's turn. But you do have the wealth of depth from which to say, this is a wow thing. This is a wow thing. I remember when I took my little boy to play t-ball in Atlanta. I come from India. I was moved to the West. The only game I knew was cricket. I didn't know what t-ball was. I thought you go and watch them play ball and they serve you tea. But no, they put it on a tee and whack it. That's what they do. And watching him from a distance with his helmet that didn't fit, his uniform that was deliberately made dirty the first time he ran, all this stuff that goes on. Every time he whacked the ball, Nathan Yehai would stop, get to the base, do what the coach told him to put his hands on his knees. I'd be standing under a tree watching, and he'd turn in my direction to see if I'd seen that hit and go like this. "Do you see me, Dad? Did you see me, Dad?" And even now, here he is in his 30s. He writes to me the most frequent of the 3 kids, and the little guy is now a big guy, but he always wants to remind me I'm his dad. And he wants to touch base and wants to hear that word of affirmation. I've lost my parents over 40 years ago, really, 38 years ago. So I was quite young. Never cease to need them. What we do with our children is very critical. Do you know what Manasseh did with his? He offered them to an idol. Nighttime seems to have been the special time for these awful immolations. The yells of children bound to the altars, rolling into the fire from the brazen arms of the idol. The shouts and hymns of the frantic crowds and the wild tumult of drums and shrill instruments by which the cries of the victims were sought to be drowned. It rose in an awful discordance over the city, forming with the whole scene visible from the walls by the glow of the furnaces and such flames. An ideal of transcendent horror that the name of the valley became then and continues till this very day in the form of Gehenna, the usual word for hell. That valley is named today the Valley of Hinnom. Same thing, meaning hell. Why? Because of what Manasseh did there. He was succeeded by Josiah. Incredible things happened. Josiah came to the throne at the age of 8. At the age of 16, he began to seek after God. At the age of 20, cleansed his city of all that immoral belief. At the age of 26, he cleansed the temple. The Reformation came in, and he left a legacy of incredible proportions when the revival broke out under his leadership. He did 2 things. I mentioned them, followed through the logic there. Number 1, he gave them back the book of the law. He gave them back the book of the law. But let me back up a moment. He was young when this all began in his life. He was in his 20s. Let no person despise your youth. Let no person despise your youth. In the youngest years of your life, God can begin some extraordinary things. I was 17 years old in Delhi when I attempted to take my own life and was on a bed of suicide when a Bible was brought to me that changed my life. 17. And God turned my heart towards His home, towards His pattern. It so rattled my dad, my family, and all of them. They couldn't believe what had happened in the life of a teenager. So, let no person despise your youth. He gave them the book of the law. What does the book of the law tell you? Life at its core is sacred. Your word is sacred, your time is sacred, your money is sacred, your body is sacred, your worship is sacred, your relationships are sacred, your marriage is sacred. You desacralize that, and you end up with a profane way of living. He gave them the book of the law, but the second thing he gave them was taught them how to worship. And I want to close with a definition and just mention the 3 applications. Number 1, it's this. Archbishop William Temple gave the best definition of worship I have ever read. Worship is the submission of all of our nature to God. It's the quickening of conscience by His holiness, nourishment of mind by His truth, purifying of imagination by His beauty, opening of the heart to His love, and submission of will to His purpose. All this gathered up in adoration is the greatest expression of which we are capable. Quickening of conscience by His holiness, mind by His truth, imagination by beauty, heart to His love, and will to His purpose. All this gathered up. This is the unity and diversity that the Greek philosophers could never come to, that the Christian worldview gives to you and me. It brings together the skin for your life, blending together all of our proclivities to give it a unity of expression, revealing the fact that at its core, life is sacred. I think Tim's famous song sung around the world, we are here to worship. That's the definition of life. Worship is coextensive with life. It is not a moment. It is not a punctuation mark. It is the energy of soul from which all else springs. So he gave them the law, gave them the secret of worship and what it meant. 3 things happened. Number 1, it built a conviction of safety. Number 2, satisfies you with the power to change. And number 3, rescues you from the tyranny of the immediate. Can I repeat those? Builds a conviction of safety, satisfies you with the power to change, and rescues you from the tyranny of the immediate. If I can illustrate 2 of those things, and we'll be done. Safety. Billy Kim, the great Korean evangelist, talks during the Korean War. A soldier was being ordered by his commanding officer in a night of all kind of firepower breaking out while men and women being slaughtered in their shell holes and all of that. Ordered this American soldier to run and rescue his fallen mates, and the man didn't do it. He hid. He said he would, but he didn't. The commanding officer came back 3 times. He came back and said, I've ordered you to do this. Go and rescue your fallen mates. He said, yes, sir, I'll do it. But he ducked for cover. Later on, as he was commanded once more, he kept looking at his watch, and then jumped out of the shell hole. When the sun rose, one of his mates looked at him and said, what on earth were you doing when you were being commanded to go and rescue your fallen mates? All you did was keep looking at your watch till you decided to jump out. He said, I really don't follow God very closely, but my mother does. I have the greatest love and respect for my mother. And before I left, she told me at what time each day she was going to be praying for me. I was waiting for that hour to strike, and I knew under the prayers of my mother, I'd be okay. With all the firepower draped around your body, the prayers of your mother gave you greater security. Builds a conviction of safety, rescues you from the tyranny of the immediate, satisfies you the power to change. About a month ago, I was speaking at the most bloody prison in America, Angola. 5,300 prisoners, 85% of them are there on life without parole. The chaplain comes, changes everything, or the warden. As a follower of Christ, the scriptures all over the wall now. No blood, no bloodletting. They used to be given a knife to defend themselves when they came, and how do you like that for a prison? Everything's changed. No profanity, nothing. This follower of Christ. And they have a Bible study every morning. They have a theological course. 1,000 of them sitting in front of me to hear the message and being piped into every room. You go past death row, they reach out through the bars and grab your hand. They're reading the Bible. They're reading John Piper. They're reading biblical authors and so on and so forth. One guy tells me, yes, I'm here for life, but if this is what it took to bring redemption for me, I'm okay. He said, I want you to pray for my parents. They are still trapped in a prison of their own without God. You know what redemption means? That He takes you in your mess, makes you clean and beautiful, and gives you the hope and the transformation that only God is big enough to bring. If you're in need of that this morning, I hope you'll settle it before you go. If you've already experienced it, go and live it. I was telling Nikki when I came here, everywhere I go, people are talking of what Alpha has done for them. Who is Alpha? It's the Alpha and the Omega. Who is at the heart of Alpha to give you a start all over again and to redeem you. And even as that vision was launched here, it was the vision of global redemption. I'm honored to be with you. May God